All right, thanks for joining me, everyone. Charles Moscowitz, welcome to the program. My guest is Joel Pollak. He's the author of Red November. He is a senior editor at large and in-house counsel at Breitbart News Network. He hosts the Breitbart News Sunday radio show on Sirius XM. Joel, thanks for joining me today.
Good to be with you.
Joel, my first question right off the bat is that I have heard from younger people, including people that even know my family, when I mention my admiration for Breitbart News, that how could I be a supporter of Breitbart News? Because after all, aren't they anti-Semitic? Now, look, you're Jewish. Breitbart was Jewish. You've got a bureau in Israel. You're the most pro-Israel outlet in probably in the world. How did it happen that this ridiculous lie has permeated so extensively that people who know nothing about Breitbart News know this as a matter of faith?
Well, I think, first of all, people want to believe the worst about anything that is viewed as pro-Trump, and we've been supportive of the president. We've been critical too at times, but generally we are regarded as a pro-Trump outlet because we're a conservative outlet and he's governed as a conservative. So I think anything associated with Trump is liable to be hit with all kinds of crazy accusations. But this particular accusation has a history, and it begins in early March 2016 with a story by Lloyd George in the Daily Beast, which falsely accused Breitbart of using Twitter trolls to attack critics of Trump in anti-Semitic terms. And the story was 100% false. We demanded a retraction. We never got it. This fellow has gone on to write other false or misleading stories, but that was the origin of it, and people seized on it. That was at a time when Trump was looking like the likely nominee. He had just swept Super Tuesday. He had a lot of momentum, and his opponents within the Republican Party were trying to stop him from winning the nomination, and they started throwing whatever they could at him, and this Daily Beast article was part of that. Later on, when Steve Bannon, our chairman at the time, made a remark that I think it was a mistake to make. I don't think he meant it, or I don't think he understood the question, but he made a remark that we'd become the platform for the alt-right. We were never a platform for the alt-right. I think perhaps he meant we were providing some kind of coverage that was different from the mainstream. But that then connected back to the March story, and people began falsely accusing Breitbart and Steve Bannon also falsely accused of being anti-Semitic. There's nothing anti-Semitic about the site at all. It's founded by Jews, run very largely by Jews. And as you mentioned, we have a bureau in Israel. So this is just part of the smear campaign that unfortunately is your lot when you become a conservative. You have to deal with this all the time, and it has nothing to do with Trump. This is how people have attacked. I mean, it does have something to do with Trump in that, if you're associated with Trump, you get attacked even more. But this exists even without Trump. I mean, conservatives have been attacked like this for generations, and it's all ridiculous nonsense. In fact, if there's anybody who's standing up for the rights of Jews today, it's conservatives and Republicans. You've got Black Lives Matter vandalizing synagogues, and Democrats taking staunchly anti-Israel positions, unable to condemn anti-Semites in their own ranks. So it's just ridiculous. I'd ask people, particularly Jewish people, if they persist with this kind of thing and say, well, how can you vote for Trump or read Breitbart or whatever? I'd say, how can you support Black Lives Matter? They're an anti-Semitic organization. We've never seen a pogrom in America like we saw in Los Angeles during the riot on May 30th, May 31st, by Black Lives Matter, where they tore through a Jewish neighborhood and vandalized synagogues, attacked kosher stores. I mean, there's just never been anything like it in American history, but the media are quiet about it because they hate Trump and they don't want to make Black Lives Matter look bad. But you need to challenge people in your life who say things like that.
You do, but the media is so pervasive, especially with Black Lives Matter. It's almost becoming an article of faith that you have to say Black Lives Matter. I mean, as if you're supporting this organization that, as you say, they've been involved with looting and burning Black neighborhoods, destroying Black businesses, killing Black people all over the United States. And they say nothing about the deaths of many dozens of Black people in Chicago and in St. Louis, and the increase of crime and violence in Black neighborhoods across the country. So, I mean, I think we can counter that with who does care about Black lives. Black lives do matter. And
Right.
yet they control the high ground of the culture. They control the high ground of the media, and they are tightening the screws. I mean, especially in this time of pandemic and the riots, it's hard to predict what might happen. I mean, I've seen in the past, and I'm sure that you at Breitbart know about this, the censorship of conservative opinion. I mean, I've been told by people who know that my site has been shadow banned. People who are, making legitimately engaging in conservative thought, like Dennis Prager, for example, have seen numbers be, deliberately and very suspiciously dropped. And it's going to get worse, I think, as the election moves closer, especially if Trump is winning. How can we counter
Yeah.
that, Joel?
Well, there's two ways to counter it. One is to expose it and talk about it. And that's what we need to do. We need to shame people who do this. And you're absolutely right. The tech companies that have suppressed Dennis Prager's videos, that have changed search algorithms to hurt conservative new media, this is absolutely an assault on conservative opinion. Facebook's under incredible pressure from the left to do even more censorship. Twitter kicking the president off. So this has to be named and shamed. And weirdly, our friends on the left don't seem to understand that they're behaving like the bad guys they used to fight. I mean, the left used to be in favor of civil liberties and freedom of speech, not anymore. So we need to shame them about that. And the other thing is there has to be some sort of legislative or regulatory effort to rein in these companies. They've become monopolies. They control not just search traffic, but they control advertising as well. And when you control so much of those two markets, you can basically control the entire media through a few companies. The CEO of Google can decide to swing an election effectively by changing the search results or by directing people to certain websites or voter registration or whatever. And that's way too much power for any company to have. That's not just corporate power. That's not just economic success or economies of scale. That's a kind of market control that is illegal under the antitrust legislation in this country. And so I think we need to take a very hard look at applying the law to these companies that have existed so far in a rather lawless space.
Well, there doesn't seem to be any will to do that, especially in Congress, because the congressmen themselves, including Republicans, are concerned about being censored. They're concerned about being attacked, and plus they're pouring money into those offices. And I just I don't think it's going to get better. I mean, I think that we're going to see like a real diminution of opinion, a real shrinkage of genuine debate. The left doesn't care. They don't have shame. I mean, they're not going to be shamed because I don't think they ever cared. Now they control the high grounds for sure. Now they're all for censorship, and I think that they're fairly open about it. I mean, here in Boston, I mean, where I am, I watch this NPR show where all of the journalists get on every week and talk about media, and they were all, without question, bragging about how wonderful it is that Facebook is being boycotted and that they need to tighten up on their censorship of President Trump. They're celebrating this, and I fear that this
Right.
is they're going to. And now there are certain words you can't mention on the internet, like you cannot talk about voting, because they're pushing this phony vote by mail fraud thing. You can't mention a word like hydroxychloroquine, right? I mean,
Right.
there are certain these
Yeah.
go through an algorithm.
Vote by mail would be okay if it were combined with a kind of voter ID check. We send our taxes in by mail, right? Everybody sends their taxes in. Nobody's too worried. Although I should say, my taxes have been opened in the last 2 or 3 years. My taxes have been opened. I've had taxes returned to me with opened envelopes and
That is
documents all over the place.
outrageous. That's something
Yeah,
criminal.
yeah. So I don't know if people are doing it on purpose or if it's just coincidence, mistakes at the post office or whatever. But assuming you could provide some secure way of delivering ballots, you also need to have some sort of unique code, like a QR code or some sort of personal identification number or a fingerprint, electronic fingerprint. If you don't have that, you can't have vote by mail because it's just too easy to cheat. This is how Democrats have cheated in California. They combine vote by mail with ballot harvesting. So they allow themselves to hire party operatives who are completely unvetted, who may have criminal records. We don't know what they are. Whoever, you can hire whoever. And they can show up at people's houses and collect ballots and return as many as possible. And that's just not a way to run a voting system. There's no country in the world that does it that way. And even in poor countries like South Africa and India and so forth, you have to show up with identification to vote. It makes it a little more cumbersome, but these are poor countries with recent histories of racism or colonialism or whatever, and it doesn't stop them from making sure that people use identification. Vote by mail is extremely vulnerable to fraud. Now, if we could do it right, I would be in favor of it, because I do think there are a lot of Republican voters, particularly seniors, who would prefer to vote by mail. People don't want to go to the polling places, especially this year. So I worry that we're going to lose some Republican voters because they've been scared off now from vote by mail, because they are being told that it's bad. And I think it's bad the way the Democrats want to do it, because they want to make it easier to cheat. It takes years to set these systems up, by the way. It's not like you can just snap your fingers and collect a bunch of ballots. I mean, these things take a long time to work on, to test, to see if they work in special elections, to troubleshoot, to refine the systems. Now they want to do it first time in November. I mean, there's no way anyone will trust the legitimacy of the results if that's what they do.
No, even the head of the Washington State Election Bureau, a liberal Democrat, has stated that it takes years for a state to set up a system by which this could be done. And obviously, people in nursing homes have a legitimate reason to have an absentee vote. At least those who have survived, the
Right.
big red state placement of COVID-19 contagious people in their homes. But given the volatility of everything that's going on, and the unknown after effects of living in a condition of medical martial law, basically, and the rioting, it's hard to determine how things are going to shake out in November. I mean, the president has been so demonized and so consistently on the mainstream media, and that they're openly refusing to cover anything positive about him. I mean, the speech in Tulsa was an incredible speech, and yet the only thing they talked about was how terrible it is that he had people go out and expose themselves allegedly to the virus. I mean, I just wonder, what do you think is going to happen? I mean, how are things going to go? The polls, which I don't believe, but yet they're scary, look like they're going to elect Biden. What do you say?
Well, I think it's too early to know. I think that the question facing the American public is who is best to lead us forward out of this. And it's Donald Trump's election to lose still, even though he's behind in the polls. This is something he can do. He has to project a sense that he knows where to take the country. Now, I think the Rushmore speech was a step in the right direction, even though he also attacked the enemies. He called them evil, the people who are tearing down the statues, and he implicitly attacked Joe Biden. So it was an aggressive speech, but I think it needed to be, because America is under attack from within, from the far left. And the Democratic Party has embraced that far left, because they're bringing people out into the streets and they're creating a sense of chaos that Democrats want to create to unseat President Trump. I think his speech was very good. It looked forward. It talked about how the best is yet to come, even though he was defending history. So that's exactly the right balance, something like that. I think he needs to do more of that. I think the country is waiting to be led. I don't think people trust Joe Biden to lead the country, but if people feel like Donald Trump can't lead the country, they will take a risk on the organization behind Biden, whoever that is. Everybody knows Biden's not running anything. He's not running his campaign. He won't run his administration if he wins. He's basically the puppet of the younger, able-bodied, able-minded people behind him, who largely consist of a mix of Obama alumni and Bernie Sanders ideologues. And that's who's going to be running the country. And they're not shy about it. They're already having their candidate issue statements about systemic racism and revolutionary institutional changes and transformation. These are radical, radical things to say. I don't think they match up with anything Joe Biden has done in the rest of his career. So in a sense, they're taking advantage of the fact that the public knows Joe Biden is kind of a backslapping moderate, whereas what he's saying and promising now is wildly radical stuff. We've never seen any candidate in the history of the United States campaign on a platform like this. And I write about that in Red November, how we got to this point, how this is the most left-wing primary we've ever had. And I don't think Americans want that. People don't want to rewrite history, and they don't want this radical group to take over. They don't like the method through which the statues are being challenged. People are okay, I think, with changing names or statues and that sort of thing. But the mob force in the streets is just something people don't want to yield to. So I don't think Biden's secured the vote yet, but I don't think Trump has won re-election yet. Now there's time. He's got to come out in a very positive, forceful way. I think he has to focus. He has to be disciplined. And we saw that he can do it at Rushmore. I think he can do more of that. And I think he's got a window where he can still do it. But if we come to September, October, and he hasn't done that yet, then I do think the country's in a very serious is at risk of undergoing what could be a socialist revolution. The Democrats want a second American revolution. They want to get rid of the filibuster. They want to add DC as a state to permanently cement their Senate majority. They want to expand the Supreme Court. They want to pack the courts. They want to make changes that will be almost irreversible. They want amnesty. They're going to legalize 11 million illegal aliens to vote immediately. They're going to change the political and cultural makeup of this country irreversibly. And the Trump voters will be not just a minority, because they were a minority last time, even though he won the majority in the Electoral College, but Trump voters will be a persecuted minority. And when Joe Biden says he's looking at the election as a chance to rip the roots out of systemic racism, he's not just talking about getting rid of racism. He's not just talking about getting rid of systemic racism today, whatever that means. What is systemic racism? None of them can define it. But he's also talking about the roots of systemic racism. That's what communists say when they say the revolution has to keep on going. Because if you're trying to attack the roots of something, everything is the roots. You know, the Cartesian mathematics is the roots of systemic racism. I mean, you just make anything up and it fills the blank. So I think we're actually headed for a very, very scary, possibly totalitarian situation after November. And I'm not trying to
I'm with you.
Look at the behavior, and also look at what they're doing right now. Look at the cancel culture, the woke mobs. If you don't say their mantra, you get fired, you lose your job.
Destroyed.
The silencing on social media. The only hope of slowing that down, I don't even think that it's going to be over after November, but I think the hope of slowing it down is to reelect Donald Trump.
No, I think it's the only thing standing in the way, as you say, of basically a communistic revolution in this country. And the kind of the support that they've got, that point of view gets in this country has never been more than maybe 20-25%, going all the way back to the turn of the 19th century. But yet this year is different. I mean, with all that's going on and with the 3 years of demonization, I mean, every night the news, people depend on the 6 o'clock news still, and they see, all three networks talking about the horrible scandal of Donald Trump ordering an extra scoop of ice cream at a party, and the negativeness and the hatefulness of it is so pervasive. Yeah. That combined with these terrible crises in which people are being thrown out of work, and all of the things that they're willing to go to such lengths. It's hard to know what's going to happen. I mean, it's very unwieldy.
Yeah, it is. And all of that comes together. And I talk about that in Red November, how this started right after Donald Trump got elected with the emergence of the so-called resistance. Now, the resistance comes to some extent from Star Wars. I mean, they were thinking of Star Wars, I think. But it also comes out of the Second World War. They were giving themselves this title and casting Trump and Trump supporters as the Nazis. So in their minds, they didn't just lose an election and have to rebuild. They were under foreign occupation by fascist power. And they styled themselves as a kind of underground resistance. And they had the media on their side. The media have 100% been about getting rid of Donald Trump. They had the deep state on their side. And I write about all of that in the book. What's really fascinating about this primary is it coexisted with an effort to impeach President Trump. And that's almost never happened. The first impeachment also happened during a presidential primary, although the primary process was very different back then. But when they impeached Andrew Johnson, it was right before the Republican National Convention. So you can argue that those two were similar, but they didn't have the kind of weeks-long campaigns then that we do now. And Democrats basically interrupted their own campaign to impeach the president. It's also just unthinkable that you would do this in an election year. I mean, they had no basis for doing it anyway. It was always a sham. But they did it to delegitimize Trump, and the media were 100% on board. Right. And I don't think we have actually experienced a free and fair election. I mean, I think this is probably the most unfree election we've had. And it's only going to be through the complete determination of conservatives to save the country that Donald Trump is going to be reelected. And he has to lead them. He has to show them that he's willing to do that.
Yeah, I mean, the whole 3 years of this conspiracy theory that somehow Donald Trump was supposed to believe is a Russian spy. And They're still going to that well. I mean, now with the bounty hunters, the Ruskies are coming. There's a Russian
Right.
that reminds me of my old grandparents' generation. You know,
Right. I
the
mean,
Reds are,
there's an example. That's classic fake news, right? There's nothing about that story that's true.
yeah.
So they asked Biden these softball questions. What do you think of President Trump not listening to warnings about bounties being paid by Russia? And they just ramble on. So Biden gets a free shot on Trump for something that never happened. And meanwhile, it was Biden and Obama who appeased Russia for at least
Yeah.
6 of the 8 years. I'll give them credit for the last 2 years when they quietly and gently admonished Russia here and there. But the first 6 years of the Obama and Biden administration were complete retreat from missile defense, from the Middle East. They gave Russia full control in Syria with a phony chemical weapons deal that John Kerry negotiated. They gave away Crimea, and they never saw it coming. They didn't do anything about it. Then they complained that Putin was playing by 19th century rules. I mean, this was the most appeasing administration that we've ever had toward Russia. The only possible parallel would be Bill Clinton, but he was trying to work with the liberals inside the new Russian Federation,
Right.
and he had a close relationship with Yeltsin.
China.
Yeah, so I mean, the media can run on a news cycle for a week and a half on a fake news story that just has no relevance. I largely ignored that one because I just didn't feel like getting into something so fake.
Right.
I think Trump is in control here. Trump can win re-election if he projects a positive message and a disciplined one.
And meanwhile, you have Biden showing up at a press conference where only about 20 people showed up, and he's reading off of the teleprompter, which President Trump accurately noted in a tweet tells you that he had been fed the questions in advance. It's sort of like when Donna Brazile gave Hillary Clinton the questions in advance of a debate. And he
I don't know about that, but let me just put it this way. I don't know about that, but I don't know if it made a difference because the journalists who went to that press conference were certainly not in a mind to ask any real questions. He came with a teleprompter, he read his little speech, and then he had a list in order of people to call on. Trump never had that. Obama did that. Obama used to have lists of people. So that's a way of screening out anyone who might ask a challenging question. So the journalists on that list, whether Biden had the questions or not, he had the names, and that's as good as having the questions because when you are handpicked like that, you're not going to ask a tough questions. We got no questions whatsoever about the new revelations that Biden was involved in prosecuting Michael Flynn. We got no questions about Hunter Biden and Burisma. We got no questions other than the question about his cognitive ability. That was the most challenging it got. But that was set up so that Biden could deal with the issue and move on. The media are desperate to get Biden elected. Biden, they believe, will put them back in power. That's why they want him to win.
And he can't even string a sentence together. I mean, the man is obviously impaired. And I think that Reince Priebus said it best when he said the best thing that can happen for Trump is that he brings Biden out of the basement and they have a few debates. I don't think Biden is going to leave the basement. I don't think there will be any debates.
Well, I think that if there are no debates, Trump obviously will make a big deal out of that. I think that's a mistake for the Biden camp, frankly. You don't want to risk anything that close to the election. So there may be debates. They'll find some way to do it. But if there aren't, I mean, obviously that helps Trump. But again, this is all about Trump. This election right now is about Trump. The Democrats are going for red November. They're going for socialism. And there's no doubt about it. I mean, Biden is criticized from the left as being a moderate, but his policies right now are almost indistinguishable from Bernie Sanders. He's not really in control of his own agenda. The only remaining difference is that while Bernie Sanders wants Medicare for all, Biden wants Medicare for all above age 60. And below age 60, you have a choice. But clearly the goal is to push America toward a fully government-run healthcare system. In every other issue, Biden is on Sanders' side. He wants to end the fossil fuel industry. He said so himself at the Detroit debate, which I read about. He wants to use federal funding for abortions. He wants to stop the Keystone Pipeline. I mean, everything.
All of it, every position,
yeah, everything.
Borders, the whole bit. And yet they've had the pandemic and the use of the medical in-house thing, which is unprecedented. Now they've had the riots, which they've somehow tried to pin to Trump, even though it all happened in liberal cities and liberal states, and it had nothing to do with Trump. And I think that it worries me what they're going to come up with between now and November, because I think they'll do anything to stop Trump for reasons that are much more profound than simply policies domestically. I think that Trump is a figure that could wake up the world in a way. His movement, the idea of national sovereignty and of putting a nation first. That's a counter-revolutionary idea. You know, that's every nation ought to hear that, and I think it runs against this internationalist, globalist, world order establishment that's been in place since World War II. And I think as such, they want to stop Trump by any means possible. So what do you think they might do? I mean, what card might they play at the end? God forbid it might be something dangerous to Trump. But I mean, what do you think they're going to do now, Joel?
Well, they're doing it. I mean, look, they want to create as much chaos as possible. They want to create the sense the country is ungovernable, and that if you elect Trump for another 4 years, you're going to get more of this. And this is exactly how socialists function. They basically try to create as much disorder as possible, and then they provide the answer for the disorder. It's like in the old story of the vacuum cleaner salesman who would go door to door, and he'd show you how good his vacuum was by throwing dirt on your rug and then vacuuming it up. You know, he creates the problem and he's got the solution. So that's how Democrats are using these protests. Mm-hmm. You said something earlier about international relations. You know, I consider myself a bit of an internationalist, kind of a globalist, in the sense that I think that the world really matters. I also think that the world's under threat, and it's under threat from China. It's under threat from Chinese nationalism and expansionism, and the liberal international order, which I think has benefited humanity, not just the elites, although yes, I think the elites have taken advantage, and I think that's an important criticism. But we can't even have the prosperous world of the post-war era with an aggressive China that's dumping cheap goods on countries all over the world, that's recolonizing Africa, that's belligerent towards its neighbors in the Western Pacific. China really is the problem. And if Donald Trump is defeated for re-election after he's the first president to take on China, and you replace him with Joe Biden, who's been a China appeaser for decades. I mean, his son's business ties with China, Biden's defenses of China on the campaign trail. We are looking at an appeasement approach to China if Biden wins, which is the worst possible thing right now. We will pull China back from the brink. They're having economic problems, social problems, political problems. Now's the time to keep up the pressure, because we want to make sure that China is a responsible player on the world stage, not an aggressive imperialist player, which disrupts the existing free exchange of goods, people, and ideas. We want that liberal international order. I know that it's not fashionable to say so, and I said during the 2016 election, I'm a globalist for Trump. You know, I believe in a strong international order. The problem is the international order's always been corrupted by Russia. It's almost a given. But China now is a serious player, not just in the UN Security Council, but is really having a malevolent influence in many, many different ways. And Biden and the Democrats were a big part of creating that malevolent influence.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and I think we can have an international order while putting our nation first in that order and letting other nations do the same.
Yeah, I agree.
The international concert of nations, if you will. Joel Pollak, listen, I want to thank you for joining me. Your book is Red November. Will the country vote red for Trump or red for socialism? Where can people get your excellent book?
You can get it at Center Street Publishing or Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, anywhere books are sold. It comes out on Tuesday, July 14th.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Joel. Hope to have you back.
Thanks. Yeah, hope to be back.